Just a little bit of context about this dialogue, why we're having it now. The world is in the grips of another unfolding global food crisis and an imminent recession. And this is the third global food crisis in the past 50 years. And this is occurring less than 15 years after the 2007 to 2012 food crisis. Now, one would have thought that, with these crises occurring again and again, and also there have been economic and financial crises that have occurred in the last 20, 30 years, that definitely policymakers at the national and international, global, regional levels would have undertaken steps to safeguard some of those most crucial, essential aspects, goods and services that are, that we need for life to be sustained. And food is definitely one of them. For food, public health, there's water, there's access to land, access to medicines and healthcare. But instead, we see that the steps that we would have expected policymakers to take have not been taken. And instead, if we look at the reports released by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Programme, IFAD, UNICEF, and WHO, this is a report called The State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition in the World, was very telling. It showed that the number of people that increased in terms of hungry people, people facing hunger and malnutrition, that increase in 2020 was more in 1 year than the past 3 or 4 years combined. And the authors of this report, these multilateral agencies, have been warning that moderate and severe food insecurity has been rising since 2014. And, of course, the estimated increase of people affected by hunger in 2020 was because of COVID, and in 2021 was also because of COVID and so on. And that went across to more than 320 million people. But, in a single year, nearly 1 in 3 people in a world of 2.37 billion did not have access to adequate food. And if we look at the 2022 SOPI report, world hunger rose even further, and reflecting more exacerbation of inequalities across the world because of unequal patterns of economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and also income losses among those most affected by the pandemic. But of course, one of the things that's important to note here is that global policymakers and global policy agencies kept talking about the importance of keeping global value chains and global markets and food markets and agriculture and food trade open. And these have been the policy recommendations for the last 5-6 years. So since the last food crisis. Now, if these policy measures were the ones to actually bring out of food crises and out of the kind of, the economic recession or the depressed economies that these food crises were triggered by and caused, why is it that food hunger in the world has been increasing from 2014 onwards? Why have these policy measures not delivered? What's wrong with global policy making and national policy making? Another important issue here is the effect, of course, of inflation in consumer food prices, which are stemming from the different economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the other measures put in place, to contain the pandemic. Now, research shows that these measures to contain the pandemic have definitely increased costs and worsened, the unaffordability of healthy diets across the world. Now, one of the important things to note here is that between 2019 and 2020, Asia witnessed the highest surge in the cost of a healthy diet, 4%. It was actually way more than Africa, which was only 2.5%. And the argument that is often made is that Asia, is a region that is full of agricultural investment, and agriculture is being modernized, but at the same time, majority of the Asian countries are, relying on agrarian economies. So despite this, why is it that the cost of healthy diets in Asia have gone up way more than all other regions in the world? And of course, when we look at what governmental arguments or many, the responses, not the explanations that are provided by many policy research organizations as to why this is happening, hunger going up, why are inequality and economic insecurity going up. At least in this year, most governments and multilateral agencies are by and large, putting the lion's share of the blame to the global supply shortages coming from the war in Ukraine, which resulted in soaring prices for grain, energy, fertilizer, fuel, and other products that are sourced from that region, in Ukraine and Russia. But they are ignoring important structural flaws in the global food system. And these have been foregrounded not only by the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, but also by the climate crisis and by all the past financial crises and economic crises that we have seen. And what are these flaws? These flaws include global value chains, multi-level and cross-sectoral market concentration, financialization, and the expansion of corporations into our agri-food systems that have made the global food system extremely susceptible to commodity speculation and price volatility. And, even the FAO's price index shows that although wheat futures prices shot up dramatically this year after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, food price volatility was already ramped well before this, with food prices reaching record levels. So there is actually an abundance of evidence to show that policy responses to past food crises have enabled the rise of a financialized global industrial food system that functions through these very complex value chains, through corporate-dominated global trade and unregulated commodity food futures markets. And these have made, as I said earlier, the so-called global food system extremely susceptible to crises, whether it's through commodity speculation or hoarding or price gouging and so on. But the most important aspect here, I think, is that they have undermined the rights, health, and agency of majority of the world's people. And those who are already most affected by these responses and policies and face the most heightened risks of future negative impacts are people and communities who produce most of the world's food through small-scale family production and as workers in the industrial food production systems. And those workers who produce the goods and services that ease our lives and that our lives, depend on. So what's the way forward? Now, again, multilateral agencies, international financial institutions, many UN agencies and governments are talking about increasing food production using high technology, innovative solutions, as they say, to build up climate resilient agriculture, to, feed the world's population in a time of crisis. But at the same time, we have social movements, small-scale peasant organizations, producers organizations, foremost among which who are La Via Campesina, and also a number of fishers groups and small-scale pastoralists and urban agriculturalists who are talking about agroecology. Now, is agroecology the way forward? And if so, why and how? And what does it offer us that other so-called innovative high-tech solutions do not offer us? So we're here to have a dialogue on these issues in the context of this, the larger macro conditions, the broader macro conditions that I described earlier. So my first question is, what are the economic, environmental, climatic, and political conditions that small-scale food producers are facing globally, regionally, and nationally? How do these conditions affect their abilities to produce food, and how do they also affect the right to food?
Well, I think that small farmers, peasant farmers, local people, indigenous people, villagers around the world are facing a tremendous attack on their livelihood, on their ability to remain in rural areas, to remain as food producers, to continue their traditional life. And this attack is coming essentially from global capitalism and private sector locally in each country. We have land grabbing for many different purposes, whether it's mining, whether it's agribusiness monoculture, whether it's corporate plantations. And now small farmers face not only climate change that affects the climatic conditions for agricultural production, but they're even facing what we call green grabbing, which is that the Machiavellian climate policies being pushed by governments and the private sector under the climate negotiations are in fact a cover for new ways to grab the land from small farmers so that land can be placed in carbon credit markets and companies can get paid for so-called reforestation, which is in fact is our corporate monoculture plantations. And so this puts rural people at risk, and it also puts consumers at risk because as the 70%, excuse me, the 70% of food currently produced by small farmers is at risk through these forces. It means that consumers are increasingly dependent on corporate food, which is produced in monoculture with chemicals, poisons, in the case of vegetables, pesticides, in the case of meat, hormones and antibiotics. And so it makes food much more unhealthy. And so really everybody is suffering except for the owners of the companies that are threatening these livelihoods and threatening our food supply.
Adding to what Dr. Rosset said, let me give you some glimpses from the ground from India. We have seen this historical struggle of farmers during the COVID, asking the withdrawal of the 3 black laws, which were popularly called as black laws, the farm laws. And at the same time, the farmers of India have been demanding for the minimum support price. And so the price has been a very major issue in India. And in spite of, producing food, in spite of all the vulnerable situations, when the farmer is taking his or her produce to the market, it's basically auctioned. It's not even, the price is not even fixed in a dignified manner in respect to the production. And when it comes to the environmental and climatic conditions, last year we have seen from the last almost year and a half, in southern part of India, it has, continuously raining. Basically, last year, the government of Karnataka, where I come from, had reported 40% of losses, agricultural losses. And this year, basically, we don't have any produce. So it's basically a wet drought. It's not a dry spell anymore, but it's there is a lot of rain, and especially the rain-fed farmers, people who are growing predominantly maize and cotton, have been directly hit. And in one of the central district from the central Karnataka called Haveri, a local media has reported that in the last 10 months, more than 112 farmers have committed suicide. On the political conditions, none of the governments, neither the state or nor the central government, are serious about addressing this deep agrarian crisis that we are getting into, and the deep food crisis that we are getting into.
One of the major crises in India is now the farmers' income. Incomes are going down, and then the current government said will double farmers' income in last 7 years, but it is nowhere nearer to even to that. So government promises remain like that. Whereas on the other hand, the living costs are increasing significantly because of a lot of privatization of support services. So education, health, and all is getting privatized. So your living costs are increasing, but the incomes are not increasing. So that's a serious crisis which is happening. And if you look at why the incomes are not increasing, one side there's a production cost increasing. On the other hand, market prices are stagnant. So that's what is a issue see. And in a situation where India has small and marginal farmers, large number, 83% of the farmers have less than 1 hectare of land. So in getting the entire income only from crop production is not sufficient. So while the prices is an important issue, but the prices itself is not the major issue, I would say, because even if there's a very good crop from 1 hectare, very good price in the market, also probably they'll get additional 10%, not more than that. So that is not sufficient. We should look at how an integrated approach is taken to provide livelihood support, because there are two problems which people are facing with. One, the landholding is very small and there is a land use shift happening. A lot of land is getting into the hands of the people who are not into agriculture. Basically, it's real estate. So people buy land and then keep it fallow, or give it on lease. So the tenant farmers are increasing, and tenant farmers' identity is not there. So tenant farmers doesn't get any support from the government. So that is a major issue. How the livelihood supports can be provided so that income diversification can happen at farmers level is something which is very important. Second, the data shows that the last 40, 50 years, land degradation is increasing because of the high use of water, high use of chemicals. So there's a huge desertification happening. And to address that, no efforts have been made. So pretty soon you may not have land itself. So whatever land is there, either it is going for real estate or it is getting spoiled. So the land is getting destroyed. That's one major variation. And the government investments and support to agriculture is very varying. I would say the minimum support price is announced for 24 crops, but only 2 crops are procured, and only from 2 states. So rest of the states have no procurement also. So the farmers are all left to the markets, and markets are very ill organized. So that's where actually the problem lies. And we need to figure out different approach for other crops, other farmers, other states as well. So what happened in 50s, 60s, the same approach extending to all farmers is not going to work, because now only rice and wheat is procured, and only from 2 states it is procured. Rest of the states are left to their fate. Rest of the crops are also left to their fate. So large number of rain-fed farmers suffer. Large number of even paddy growers from Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, they also suffer. So we have to figure out that way. On the other hand, governments are not understanding the problem of climate change, the seriousness of the climate change. I would say in states like Odisha, for example, in the last 100 years, there were 60 years of floods. 60 years there were crop failure. There are states like, say, in districts like Anantapur in Andhra Pradesh, where in 10 years, there is years. So, but the insurance mechanisms or the production systems in that areas are not changed. So that is becoming a major problem. Climate change is becoming a serious problem. We are not working towards mitigating it. So reducing chemical use, reducing water use, providing life-saving irrigation. So that systems are not working. On the other hand, the mechanisms, financial mechanisms to cover the risk, like insurance and disaster compensations, are completely not working. And particularly in a situation where tenant farmers are not identified, women farmers doesn't have land, so they are not identified. Tribal farmers doesn't have land rights, so they are also not identified. Dalits not identified. So all those people who are not identified won't get any support from the government. So the support is only for land ownership. So all agriculture related support is only for land ownership. So today, yesterday we were seeing in Odisha, even the minimum support price procurement is based on iris identification done through, and then only those farmers who has land on their name and also who has that identity registered with the government are getting the procurement. So procurement, even though it is happening from the government side, that also is not reaching out to the needy people. So a significant change in the policies are required to suit small and middle farmers, particularly shifting towards organic natural farming, because say today chemical fertilizer subsidy in India is nearly 2.5 lakh crores, 2.5 lakh crores per annum. And for all those farmers who are shifting towards agroecological approaches doesn't get any support. So the states like Punjab, for example, a farmer gets nearly 28,000 rupees subsidy. A farmer in Odisha gets 3,000 rupees subsidy. So there is a distortion between states also. So like internationally, we talk about some states, some countries getting more support, some countries completely neglected, and then we are trying to create a kind of platform where they can, like an open market between them. In India, the same thing is happening between states also. So we need to figure out how equitable support is also available to the farmers. I think that's a key challenge. So certain things lies in that in the context of environmental issues, but large also are linked to the economics and institutional issues. So when we talk about agroecology, I think we should look at all these together.
Okay.
Farmers, institutions, policies together.
Why is then small-scale food production important? If if small-scale food producers by and large are farming on small tracts of land, many of them are in marginal lands, and maybe not only in India, but across the region and across the world and in other regions, as Peter can tell us. Why would we make an argument to support them? What is the place and role of small-scale food production in ensuring that everybody has enough, sufficient healthy food? Because there are more and more agri-food corporations who are claiming that they are able to feed the world with technology that is climate resilient, that is not environmentally damaging, and so on. And that they even have a solution for the use of fossil fuels. I mean, the industrial agriculture. So coming back to you, Peter, first.
Well, I think, Shal, a lot of it you summarized in your introduction, but just to repeat a few key points, I think that we have to understand first how unhealthy corporate food is, which is our option if small-scale food produced by small-scale producers is decreasingly available. And so if we can take the recent COVID epidemic and the so-called COVID comorbidity factors, which I think very well explain why we shouldn't be eating so much corporate food. Some of the comorbidity factors, in other words, things that made people more likely to die from COVID, were obesity, malnourishment, diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers, most of which are food and diet related illnesses, and most of which are associated with a diet heavy in industrial processed food and containing pesticides and hormones and antibiotics in the case of animal protein coming from the corporate sector. And so we can talk about it a little bit later, but it's likely that that corporate agriculture and food production could have also been responsible for COVID. But let's just say that people who were more likely to perish from COVID were those who were more either dependent on eating food from the corporate food system or malnourished because the fact of a commodified corporate food system means that if you don't have money, you don't have access to enough food at all. So I think that what we really saw is how corporate food makes us sick and leaves other people out of access to food altogether. And then, as you said, the long commodity chains, value chains, where food is produced in one country with inputs that come from a different country and then shipped to a third country where it's consumed by people who buy in a supermarket, all of that collapsed during the pandemic due to lockdowns and other factors. And now with the war, as you mentioned, between Russia and Ukraine, also that food, that long value chain, those long value chains are highly stressed. And so I think we can see that corporate food is unreliable in times of crisis. People fell back on peasant markets and locally produced food, as they should. And we see how the corporate food was making us sick, making us predisposed to die from COVID. And this is yet another argument why we need the usually more healthy and potentially way more healthy, if we talk about agroecological production, food coming from local farmers and peasants. Over to the next person.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. So you've highlighted not only the issues of health and ecology, but also the insecurity of relying on a market system that itself is fickle and financialized. So, Chuki, I would like to pose the same question to you, especially from the perspective of an international small-scale food producers, peasant producers movement. Why has La Via Campesina highlighted the, and emphasized the importance of small-scale food production and peasant production? And you are a peasant producer yourself. So your views on this, please.
The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations, itself acknowledges that the 75% of the food globally is still produced by the small-scale farmers, which is a reality. Also, when it comes to the Indian context, we are still a majority. Though the population who depend on agriculture has drastically come down after the liberalization policies, but we are still a majority in the country. And adding to what Peter was talking about, the unhealthy production by the corporate companies, the other important factor is agriculture. Agriculture sector is a sector where you generate employment. So most of the young people are leaving agriculture because of the economic unviability of agriculture. But during the pandemic, we have seen how those who still held land had to come back. The only option left for them was the land that they could come back. So agriculture is still, as a sector where the employment generation takes place, and land usage is done in an efficient manner when it is small. When the whole family gets involved, each and every inch of the land is taken care of, and something is produced. And we are talking about food sovereignty. Food sovereignty can be achieved only when the small-scale food producers, who are the majority of the population, they themselves grow the regional food and the food that is grown seasonally, which is also healthier. So it's not just there are two approaches to it, as we all know. The corporate wants to see land and food as a commodity, but for the small peasants, it's the Mother Earth. They never look at this, look at the land in terms of square foot or acres. So it's basically, whatever the Mother Nature gives them to feed their own families and their own communities. So these are the two different approaches that will, take care of the climate change and food insecurity of the world.
Thank you, Chuki. You also did now more points on this, because if majority of the world, if 75% of the world's food is being produced by small-scale food producers, they are definitely feeding majority of the world.
Yeah, adding on to what Chuki said, it's not only 75% produced, but 40% self-consumed as well. So they produce food for themselves. They're self-employed. So they are generating livelihood for themselves. So if they move out of agriculture, producing so much food and supplying to them, or creating employment opportunities is next to impossible. I think that's a major issue also we need to recognize. They're not dependent on anyone. They're not dependent on government. They're producing on their own, and then they are also feeding themselves. And in the next 50 years, whatever changes happens in India, still we are going to have at least 1 million families depending on agriculture. The proportion may come down, but absolute numbers still going to remain about 1 million families. So we need to figure out how these families get food and employment. I think that's a key thing. So second thing, very important, is the small holdings are more efficient, ecologically more efficient, economically also more efficient, because they're self-employed. They work in the farms and then do it. It's just that they are not getting enough support from the governments. So there's a distortion over there, and also they're not having enough support in terms of, say, small tools developed for them. So there's no technology nor the financial support available for them. I think that's where problem lies, not in terms of the efficiency of production. Small farms are more efficient in terms of adapting to climate change, also more efficient and in terms of productivity. So if you look at productivity per acre, per hectare productivity, if you take small farms are more efficient because they can produce diverse food and they feed themselves. And so in all, there's a good support which these small farms provide. And just to make a rough calculation, I would say if farm moves out, if this 1 million households moves out of agriculture, the same food to be provided, it will cost more than 1.5 times. See, if you have to buy from the corporates and then supply to the farmers, it costs more than 1.5 times. If you have to create employment opportunities for them, give guaranteed employment for any of them, or even create opportunities for employment, still huge investments are required. That would be much more than what is happening today. So in terms of long-term sustainability of livelihoods, families in this country, it is required to focus on small farmers. So technologies, public policies, institutions should be tuned towards that. Very unfortunately, in India, we are trying to copy from the West, where they don't have farmers. So their whole issue is that they don't have people. So their focus is on machines. Their focus is on chemicals. Their focus is on, they only have one season. So their focus is on how to grow in that one season, and the second season, how do you process and store. Whereas in India, you can grow throughout the year. So you have 3 seasons, you have wide diversity of production systems, small farmers who can work in the farms. So we need to have a different agricultural system in the country. Unfortunately, that is what is not happening.
Yeah. Why are small-scale farmers and small farms not getting the support they want to?
There are 2 problems here. One, there are vested interests, certainly corporate interests, and also there's a large scale lack of understanding also is there. I would say if you want to measure the ability of an elephant by how much it can climb a tree, like a monkey, if you keep a competition between a monkey and an elephant, how fast they can climb the tree, I think it's not going to work, unfortunately. So the problem is that we agricultural research establishment, extension establishment, the department per se thinks development lies in moving towards large farms. They feel they're unable to implement the technologies they have because we have small farms. Unfortunately, that's what they're all still caught in. And so education system is a failure. So that's where problem lies. Also, the support system. So for example, chemical fertilizer subsidy in this country is going, like I mentioned, it's about 2.5 lakh crores. And then government is struggling to put in that budget. It is nearly 15% of the Indian budget. And more than 60% of it goes into drains, literally drains, because the use efficiency of fertilizer is very low. They all know this, but they are unable to get out of that because on one side, there's a corporate interest. On the other hand, they also don't know how to go about, and they are not able to come to terms with accepting that people's knowledge matter here. Innovations happening in ground matters. So I think that's where problem lies. Till now, we couldn't come up with a policy support. If farmer makes their own inputs, how it can be supported. Or if the farmer consumes the food which they have grown. Say, if you're buying food from the government, you get at 1 rupee. But if you're producing your own food and you're using, literally you're supported for that. So self-consumption, self-employment, self-resources, if they are using it, how that can be supported is very important. Unfortunately, there is no support systems available there and no work done around that. Unfortunately, the demands coming are copied from the West, I would say. So we also need to figure out how do we change the support systems in this country, and that's where actually solution lies.
From the movement perspective, I would say that laws are always made when the civil society and social movements push the system to make the laws. Otherwise, the system basically has no brain. and they are following inputs from the economists who are basically, as Dr. Ramanjanelu was saying, they're aping from the West. And I think most of the organizations also who represent farmers, they are mostly constituted of the farmers who are basically part of the Green Revolution technology. So the small scale farmers are still not organized enough. That's what I feel from the context of India. And also when it comes to the agroecological movement, there is definitely a movement in India. There are different types of initiatives which are being taken in different parts of the country. But what is being challenging is that the public institutions like the Niti Aayog itself doesn't believe in something called agroecology. The productivity of the small scale farmers, that it is still possible to do food production without putting any synthetic chemicals or fertilizers. So there needs to be a mindset shift when it comes to the policymakers as well as the farming community. The majority of the farming community are still doing chemical farming, and unless the people who are actually working on this, they come together, forgetting the small differences that we have among us, and come together and give a strong proposal from the ground to the governments. I think that's the only way of bringing a policy change. Otherwise, I don't see, a very big policy change, in terms of. And I see that this has to happen from the southern part of India also, because most of the agroecological experiences and experiments are taking place in the southern part of India, more than in the northern part of India.
Well, I completely agree with both of my colleagues, and I would just add that we need to understand, if we want to know why governments don't understand or don't believe, we need to ask who owns the governments and who are governments beholden to. And this goes for just about every government that I know in the world, whether we're talking about the government of the US who speaks for Monsanto, the government of China who speaks for ChemChina, the government of Germany who speaks for Bayer Monsanto, the government of India who speaks for Indian agribusiness companies. Basically, the owners of politicians, the owners of government, the funders of political campaigns, the ones who set the terms of the debate with their money, both in politics and in the media and in the educational system in terms of funding educational programs, and an extension, who invites government extension agents to 3-day paid vacations and luxury hotels to learn about the technology offered by the private sector, are these same companies. And so what it really comes down to is political power, the power to determine what governments think and what the public thinks because of the control over corporate media as well, private sector media, by advertisers and by investors in media companies. And the only possible, and I think Chuki was hinting at this, the only possible counter force to money in politics is mass mobilization. And the farmers movement in southern India and other parts of India saw the enormous mobilization, as Chuki pointed out, to the three bad laws, but around the world in La Via Campesina, but it's not enough. It can't be just farmers. It has to be urban people, it has to be the urban poor, it has to be consumers, environmentalists, people concerned about health, people concerned about human rights, because the number of people who've lost their livelihoods, defenders of the land and territory who've been assassinated and jailed around the world just for defending their territory and their livelihood is completely out of control. And it's all because of the corporate owners of the food system and owners of our governments and owners even of our public universities, because with budget cutbacks, who funds research in public universities are the same corporate entities. Over.